Stay in your bunks. It's just the older kids trying to scare you. But the screaming didn't stop. The screaming started around 11 at night, right after lights out at Camp Clearwater. I was in the top bunk, still awake because my bunkmate Derek had been snoring for the past 20 minutes, when I heard it cut through the darkness. A high-pitched scream that came from the direction of the lake, maybe a quarter mile from our cabin. It was the kind of scream that made your stomach drop, the kind that didn't sound like fun or games. Derek stopped snoring and sat up so fast he hit his head on my bunk frame. "What was that?" he whispered. Before I could answer, another scream came, longer this time, and I heard movement in the other bunks. Our counselor, Nathan Greer, was supposed to be sleeping in the small room at the front of the cabin, but his door opened and he walked out in his pajama pants and Camp Clearwater t-shirt. He stood in the middle of our cabin with his hands on his hips, looking annoyed rather than concerned. "Stay in your bunks," he said, his voice flat. "It's just the older kids trying to scare you. They do this every summer. First week, they always try to freak out the younger campers." Another scream came, and this one sounded desperate, almost pleading. I was 14, old enough to know what a prank scream sounded like versus a real one. My older sister Melanie had scared me enough times growing up that I could tell the difference. This wasn't someone trying to sound scared for fun. This was actual terror in someone's voice. "That doesn't sound fake," I said from my bunk. Nathan turned to look at me, and even in the dim emergency light by the door, I could see his expression harden. "Connor, I've been a counselor here for 6 years. Every single summer, the 17 and 18-year-olds camp out by the lake and try to mess with the younger kids. Last year, they had someone dress up in a mask and run past the cabins. The year before that, they played recordings of wolves howling. This is the same thing. Now everyone go back to sleep before I start handing out demerits." Derek looked up at me from the bottom bunk, his eyes wide. We'd only been at camp for 3 days, but we'd already learned that demerits meant losing privileges. 3 demerits and you couldn't participate in the climbing wall or the zip line. 5, and you had to skip the Friday night bonfire. Nathan ran his cabin strict, but the screaming continued. Not constant, but every 30 seconds or so, another cry would pierce the night. Sometimes it sounded like words, but I couldn't make them out. Other times it was just raw sound. I counted 12 campers in our cabin, all between 13 and 15 years old, and I could hear whispers starting up in the darkness, despite Nathan's order. "Maybe someone's actually hurt," a kid named Joshua said from across the cabin. He was in my swimming group, quiet but smart. "What if it's not a prank?" Nathan walked over to Joshua's bunk and stood there until the whispering stopped completely. "You want to know what happens when counselors overreact to pranks? Last summer at the camp across the lake, a counselor called 911 because he heard screaming. They sent 3 police boats and a helicopter. Turned out it was just some kids watching a horror movie on someone's phone with the volume up. That counselor got fired and the camp almost lost its license. I'm not making that mistake." He looked around at all of us. "Everyone stays in their bunks. That's final. The next person who argues gets 5 demerits." The cabin went silent, except for the screaming outside, which had changed pitch. Now it sounded hoarse, like whoever was making the sound had been doing it for too long. I lay in my bunk, staring at the wooden ceiling, my heart pounding. Something felt deeply wrong, but Nathan was the adult, the authority figure, the one who was supposed to know what to do. He'd been here for 6 years. Maybe he really did know better than us. Maybe this was normal for summer camp. I'd never been to sleepaway camp before. My parents had sent me here because they said I needed to build character and independence, which really meant they were sick of me spending all summer playing video games. Camp Clearwater cost them $3,000 for 4 weeks, and my mom had made me promise I'd follow the rules and not cause any trouble. So when Nathan said stay in your bunk, that's what I did, even though everything in my body was telling me to get up and go check the lake. The screaming continued for another 5 minutes, getting weaker and more sporadic. Then it stopped completely. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise had been. "See?" Nathan said into the darkness. "They got bored and gave up. That's what happens with pranks. They're only fun if they get a reaction." He walked back to his room and closed the door, and I heard the click of his lock. I looked down at Derek, who was staring up at me with an expression I couldn't read. Neither of us said anything because we didn't want the demerits, but I could tell he was thinking the same thing I was. That didn't sound like someone getting bored and giving up. That sounded like someone who couldn't scream anymore. I don't know if I actually slept that night or if I just lay there in a state between waking and sleeping, listening to the sounds of the forest outside. At some point, the sky started getting lighter, and I could hear birds beginning their morning songs. When the wake-up bell rang at 7, Nathan opened his door and acted completely normal, like nothing had happened. "Rise and shine, gentlemen. Breakfast is in 30 minutes. I want everyone dressed, beds made, and teeth brushed. Let's move." He clapped his hands twice, the way he always did. Nobody mentioned the screaming. We got dressed in silence, made our bunks according to Nathan's specifications with hospital corners and pillows perfectly centered, and lined up for the bathroom. The morning routine at Camp Clearwater was regimented. Nathan inspected each bunk for proper making, checked that we'd all brushed our teeth by making us breathe in his face, and had us form a line outside the cabin for the walk to the dining hall. "Remember," he said as we stood in formation. Cabin 7 has a reputation to maintain. We won the Cleanliness Award last session, and we're going to win it again. That means straight lines, no talking during transitions, and absolute respect for camp property and staff. The 11 other boys nodded. I noticed that Joshua kept looking toward the lake, which was visible through the trees from our cabin's position on the hill. The morning sun was making the water sparkle, and everything looked peaceful and beautiful. Nothing like the horror show from last night. As we walked in our silent straight line down the path to the dining hall, I kept scanning for any sign of the older kids who'd supposedly been pranking us. The dining hall was loud with the sounds of 200 campers eating breakfast. Long tables were arranged by cabin, and each counselor sat at the head of their table to monitor behavior. Nathan sat at ours, eating his eggs and bacon while keeping his eyes on us, making sure we used proper table manners. The camp director, Roger Sutherland, stood at the front of the room with a microphone, making morning announcements about the day's activities. Swim lessons at 9, arts and crafts at 10, lunch at noon, free period at 1, then various sports and activities until dinner. He went through the schedule the same way he did every morning, his voice cheerful and loud. And remember, campers, Camp Clearwater is about building friendships, developing skills, and creating memories that last a lifetime. Let's make today count. The room erupted in the obligatory cheer, and then we were dismissed by cabin number. As cabin 7 stood to leave, I saw 2 counselors talking urgently near the kitchen door. One of them was holding a walkie-talkie and looked pale. Roger walked over to them quickly, and their conversation became animated but quiet. We were heading to the swimming area for our morning lesson, when one of the lifeguards came running up the path from the lake, moving so fast he was almost sprinting. He ran past us without even acknowledging Nathan's greeting, heading straight for the camp director's office in the main building. Nathan watched him go with a frown, then turned back to us. Keep moving. We're going to be late. But I noticed his confident tone from earlier had wavered slightly. The swimming area at Camp Clearwater was beautiful, a roped-off section of the lake with a floating dock and a designated shallow area for beginners. Our swim instructor, a college student named Amy Chen, was usually early and enthusiastic, but this morning she wasn't there when we arrived. Nathan checked his watch, looking irritated. Typical. The activity instructors here have no sense of professionalism. We stood on the beach in our swim trunks, waiting, and I used the opportunity to scan the lake more carefully. The older kids' camping area was on the far shore, maybe half a mile away. I could see tents set up, and what looked like the remains of a campfire, but no movement. Amy finally appeared 15 minutes late, but she didn't look her usual cheerful self. Her face was red and blotchy, and I could tell she'd been crying. She was also wearing her regular clothes instead of her swimsuit and lifeguard outfit. "Swimming is canceled this morning," she said, her voice shaking. "Everyone needs to return to their cabins immediately." Nathan stepped forward. "What? Why? This is scheduled activity time. You can't just cancel without clearance from Roger." Amy looked at him, and I saw something in her expression that made my stomach clench. "Roger is the one who sent me to tell you. All morning activities are canceled. Everyone goes back to their cabins and stays there until further notice." Nathan's face reddened. "This is ridiculous. If this is about the prank last night, I already handled it. The older kids were just being stupid, but everything's fine now. My campers need their swimming lesson." Amy's voice rose, and I could hear the anger underneath her grief. "Nathan, go to your damn cabin, now. That's not a request." She turned and walked away before he could respond, heading back toward the main building. Nathan stood there for a moment, clearly furious at being overridden, but he had no choice. "Fine, cabin 7 back to quarters, and you can all thank the idiots who thought it was funny to pull pranks and disrupt the camp schedule." We walked back in silence, but this time the silence felt different, heavier. When we got to the cabin, Nathan unlocked the door and ushered us inside. "Free time, I guess. Stay in the cabin. I need to go find out what's going on." He left, and the moment his footsteps faded, the cabin erupted in conversation. "Someone definitely got hurt," Joshua said immediately. "Did you see Amy's face? She was crying." Derek nodded from his bunk. "And that lifeguard was running, like really running. People don't run at camp unless something's wrong." I thought about the screaming, the way it had sounded so desperate at first, then gotten weaker, then stopped. What if it wasn't a prank? I said quietly. What if someone was actually in trouble and we just lay there? The other boys went quiet. Nobody wanted to think about that possibility. We waited in the cabin for 2 hours. Through the windows, we could see counselors and staff hurrying back and forth between buildings, and at one point, 3 police cars drove up the main road into camp. Not security guards or park rangers, actual police with lights flashing. Joshua, who had the bunk near the window, gave us a running commentary. "There's a cop talking to Roger outside his office. Roger's crying. Holy shit, Roger's actually crying." I climbed down from my bunk and went to look. Camp Director Roger Sutherland was a large man in his 50s who always projected authority and confidence. Seeing him with his hands over his face, shoulders shaking, was surreal. Something terrible had happened. We just didn't know what yet. Nathan finally came back to the cabin around 11, and his face had completely changed from the confident, dismissive expression he'd worn all morning. He looked pale and shaken, and he wouldn't make eye contact with any of us. "Pack your things," he said quietly. "Camp is being evacuated. Your parents are being called to come pick you up." Derek raised his hand tentatively. "Why? What happened?" Nathan's jaw clenched. "Just pack. You'll find out soon enough." But we found out before we even finished packing because one of the camp maintenance workers came into our cabin to check something with the electrical panel, and he was talking on his phone loud enough for all of us to hear. "Yeah. They found her around dawn. One of the early morning fishermen saw her floating near the dock on the far side. Been in the water for hours. Police are saying drowning, but they're investigating because of the circumstances." He paused, listening to whoever was on the other end. 17. She was one of the senior campers, Lily Morrison, I think her name was. Apparently, she'd gone swimming after the campfire ended and never came back. Her friends thought she'd gone back to her tent, but when they woke up this morning and she wasn't there, they reported it. Too late by then. I felt like someone had punched me in the stomach. Lily Morrison. I didn't know her personally, but I'd seen her around camp. She was a CIT, a counselor in training. The maintenance worker finally noticed we were listening and quickly left, but the damage was done. We all stood there in various states of packing, staring at each other. "The screaming," Joshua said, his voice barely a whisper. "That was her. She was drowning and screaming for help, and we just stayed in our bunks." Derek looked at Nathan, who was standing frozen by the door. "You said it was a prank. You said it was older kids messing around." Nathan's face flushed red. "I didn't know. How was I supposed to know? It sounded exactly the same as every other year when the kids pull their stupid pranks. This isn't my fault." But it was his fault, and everyone in that cabin knew it. A girl had been drowning in the lake, screaming for help, and our counselor had told us to ignore it, had locked himself in his room and refused to check, had threatened us with demerits if we tried to help. I thought about those 12 screams I'd counted, each one getting weaker. 12 chances to save her. 12 times we'd done nothing, because an authority figure had told us it was nothing. My parents arrived 6 hours later to pick me up. By then, the story had spread through the entire camp. Lily Morrison had been swimming with friends after the evening campfire. They'd all gone in the water around 10, but it had been dark, and they'd been careless. The lake had a drop-off point about 40 feet from shore where the depth went from 5 feet to 20 feet in the span of a few yards. Lily had apparently swum past that drop-off and gotten into trouble. Her friends had been back on shore by then, drunk on beer they'd smuggled into camp, and hadn't noticed she was missing until it was too late. When they finally realized she wasn't with them, they'd started calling her name, but they were too intoxicated to organize a proper search. They'd assumed she'd gone back to her tent, but Lily had been in the water the whole time, struggling and screaming. The police estimated she'd been conscious and fighting for at least 15 minutes before she drowned. 15 minutes of screaming that multiple cabins had heard. 15 minutes where Nathan and 3 other counselors had dismissed the sounds as pranks. My mother hugged me so tight when she arrived that I could barely breathe. My father stood behind her, his face grave as he listened to the camp director explain what had happened. Other parents were arriving too, all of them angry and demanding answers. How had this happened? Why hadn't the counselors responded? What kind of supervision were these kids receiving? Roger kept apologizing, saying there would be a full investigation, that protocols had clearly failed, that this was an unprecedented tragedy, but the parents weren't satisfied with apologies. One father, a lawyer, was already talking about lawsuits. A mother was on her phone with the local news station. Another parent was demanding to know why the counselors hadn't been trained in emergency response. The camp was chaos. Kids crying, parents yelling, counselors looking shell-shocked. As we loaded my stuff into our car, I saw Nathan standing alone near the parking lot, watching families leave. He looked lost. A police officer approached him with a notebook, and Nathan's whole body seemed to shrink. My father saw me watching and put his hand on my shoulder. "Come on, Connor. Let's go home." The drive back was silent for the first hour. I sat in the back seat staring out the window, replaying the night over and over. The screams, Nathan's dismissive tone, the way I'd just accepted his authority and stayed in my bunk. Finally, my mother turned around in her seat. "Baby, I need you to know this wasn't your fault. You were following the rules like you were supposed to. The adults failed here, not you." But I didn't feel blameless. I was 14, not a little kid. I'd known something was wrong. I'd heard the difference between a prank scream and a real one. And I'd done nothing because I was afraid of getting demerits, afraid of getting in trouble, afraid of questioning an adult's judgment. The news broke that evening. Local station first, then it got picked up by state news, then national. "Teen drowns at summer camp. While counselors ignore her screams," was the headline I saw repeated across different channels. They showed pictures of Lily, a pretty girl with long brown hair and a bright smile. They interviewed her parents, who were destroyed. Her mother could barely speak. Her father demanded answers, his voice shaking with rage and grief. The investigation moved quickly. Within 3 days, the details were public. Multiple cabins had heard the screaming. Nathan wasn't the only counselor who'd dismissed it, but he was the closest to the lake and had the clearest ability to respond. The other counselors who'd heard it had called Nathan on the walkie-talkie system to ask if he was checking it out, and he'd assured them it was just a prank, that he had it handled. So they'd all gone back to sleep. The camp's emergency protocols were found to be severely inadequate. Counselors had no training in distinguishing real emergencies from false alarms. There was no system for verifying potential threats. The buddy system that was supposed to be in effect during swimming had been ignored during the late-night unauthorized swim. The senior campers who'd been swimming with Lily were cited for minor alcohol possession and reckless endangerment, though charges were eventually dropped because they were also teenagers who'd made terrible choices. But the real focus was on Nathan Greer and the camp administration. Nathan was fired immediately, his name and face plastered across the news. People online were vicious. The comments sections were brutal. People called Nathan a murderer, said he should go to prison, that he was a coward who'd let a girl die to avoid being inconvenienced. Someone dug up his social media and found photos of him at parties drinking, looking like a typical 24-year-old. These were turned into evidence of his immaturity and irresponsibility. Death threats poured in. His address was leaked. He had to move in with his parents and stop going outside because people would recognize him and scream at him in public. Part of me felt bad for him because he hadn't intended for anyone to die. He'd made a terrible judgment call based on pattern recognition from previous years. But then, I'd remember Lily Morrison's face in those news photos, her bright smile, her whole life ahead of her, and I couldn't quite get to sympathy. The camp closed permanently 2 weeks after the incident. Roger Sutherland resigned and gave a tearful press conference where he accepted responsibility for the systemic failures. Multiple lawsuits were filed by Lily's family and other campers' families. My parents didn't sue because they said I hadn't been directly harmed, but they followed the cases closely. The criminal investigation took months. The district attorney had to determine whether Nathan's actions rose to the level of criminal negligence. Legal experts debated it endlessly on news shows. Some said he was just a young counselor following patterns from previous years and couldn't have known this time was different. Others said that any reasonable person would have at least checked when screaming continued for that long, that his refusal to investigate was reckless indifference to human life. In the end, Nathan was charged with criminally negligent homicide. The trial started 18 months after Lily's death. I was 15 by then, a sophomore in high school, and I was called to testify. I'd never been in a courtroom before. The judge looked stern, the jury looked serious, and Nathan sat at the defense table looking years older than the confident counselor I'd known. He'd lost weight, and his eyes had this hollow quality. When it was my turn on the stand, the prosecutor asked me to describe the night. I told them everything. The screaming, Nathan's dismissive response, the threats of demerits, the way he'd locked himself in his room. The defense attorney tried to make it seem less damning. "Did the screaming sound like previous pranks you'd heard at camp?" he asked me. "I'd only been at camp for 3 days," I answered. I hadn't heard any pranks before, but it sounded real to me, not fake. "But you're not an expert in determining real screams versus fake ones, are you?" "No, but I know what fear sounds like." The defense attorney asked if Nathan had seemed malicious or cruel. "No," I admitted. He seemed annoyed. He seemed like he thought he knew better than us, that he'd seen this before and we were all overreacting. So he was making a judgment call based on experience? A wrong judgment call that killed someone. The judge told me to just answer the questions, not add commentary. But I saw several jurors nodding at my addition. Other campers testified too. Joshua described how the screaming had gone on for 15 minutes. Derek talked about how we'd all known something was wrong, but had been too afraid of punishment to disobey. Amy, the swim instructor, testified about finding Lily's body floating near the dock. The prosecution's expert witness was a camp safety specialist who'd worked in outdoor recreation for 30 years. She tore apart Camp Clearwater's protocols and Nathan's decisions. Any competent counselor, upon hearing screaming that continued for more than 1 or 2 minutes, would at minimum investigate, she testified. The failure to even look out the window, to make a simple phone call to other counselors, to take 5 minutes to verify the situation, represents a fundamental breach of duty of care. The defense called their own expert who argued that Nathan had been following reasonable protocols for dealing with camper pranks. But under cross-examination, even he admitted that after 5 minutes of continued screaming, any counselor should have investigated. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they came back, they found Nathan guilty of criminally negligent homicide. He was sentenced to 4 years in prison, though the judge acknowledged he hadn't intended harm. "Your failure to act, your dismissal of clear warning signs, and your prioritization of convenience over safety directly led to the death of Lily Morrison," the judge said. Nathan's mother screamed in the courtroom. His father sat with his head in his hands. Lily's parents held each other and cried, not in joy, but in exhausted relief that someone was being held accountable. I watched all of this from the gallery and felt nothing but emptiness. A girl was dead. A man was going to prison. Dozens of us would carry this trauma forever. And for what? Because someone had been too proud to admit they might be wrong, too confident in their pattern recognition, too dismissive of the concerns of children. I thought about how different everything would have been if Nathan had just taken 5 minutes to walk down to the lake. If he'd verified, if he'd checked. That was all it would have taken. 5 minutes of effort and humility, and Lily Morrison would have gone home to her family that summer. The lawsuits continued for years. The civil cases were settled eventually, with the camp's insurance paying out millions to Lily's family. My parents received a settlement check too, even though they hadn't sued, because the families who did sue included all campers who'd been present. I put my settlement money in an account and didn't touch it. It felt wrong to benefit financially from Lily's death. When I turned 18, I donated it to a drowning prevention nonprofit. The trauma from that night affected me in ways I didn't fully understand until years later. I developed severe anxiety around authority figures, always questioning their judgment instead of trusting it blindly. My parents thought I'd become rebellious, but it wasn't rebellion. It was self-preservation. I couldn't let another Nathan Greer make decisions for me without questioning them. I went to therapy, starting in college, after the nightmares hadn't stopped. I'd dream about being in the water, screaming, while faceless people on shore told each other it was just a prank. I'd wake up gasping, convinced I was drowning. My therapist, Dr. Rachel Foster, helped me understand that I was carrying survivor's guilt. You were a child following instructions from an adult, she said. The responsibility wasn't yours. But knowing something intellectually and feeling it emotionally are different things. I still felt like I should have done more. I graduated college with a degree in social work, specifically focused on youth advocacy and systemic reform. My first job was with a nonprofit that reviewed safety protocols at summer camps and youth programs. I became the person who checked if organizations had adequate emergency response procedures, if staff were properly trained, if there were systems in place to catch failures before they became tragedies. I thought about Camp Clearwater every single day I went to work. When I was 26, I was assigned to review a camp in upstate New York. Walking through their facilities, checking their protocols, I had this moment of profound dissonance. I was in a position of authority now, the person other people would listen to and trust. The weight of that responsibility was crushing. What if I missed something? What if my recommendations weren't enough? What if another kid died because I'd failed to identify a gap in their system? I called Dr. Foster that night and talked through my spiral. You're doing this work because of what happened, she reminded me. You understand the stakes in a way most people don't. That makes you better at this, not worse. She was right. I was meticulous in my reviews, sometimes to the point of being overbearing. I met my wife Jennifer at a conference on youth safety standards. She worked for the state licensing board that oversaw summer camps and recreational facilities. On our second date, I told her about Camp Clearwater because I couldn't be with someone long-term without them understanding this fundamental part of who I was. She listened to the whole story, then took my hand. That's why you care so much. That's why you're so good at what you do. We got married 2 years later. When we had our first child, a daughter we named Sophie, I became the most paranoid parent imaginable. Jennifer had to talk me down from my anxiety constantly. Every swimming lesson, every school field trip, every sleepover, I was terrified something would go wrong and I wouldn't be there to prevent it. You can't protect her from everything, Jennifer said gently when Sophie was 6 and wanted to go to day camp. I know, I replied, but I can try. I vetted that day camp more thoroughly than I'd vetted anything in my professional career. I met with the director 3 times, reviewed their emergency protocols, checked their counselor training records, and verified their lifeguard certifications. Nathan Greer was released from prison after serving 3 years of his 4-year sentence. I read about it in the news. There was a photo of him leaving the facility looking older and haunted. He gave one interview to a local newspaper where he said he thought about Lily Morrison every day, that he'd never forgive himself, that he hoped somehow his punishment had brought her family peace, even though he knew it couldn't bring her back. People online were split about whether he'd served enough time. Some thought he should have gotten more, that 4 years was nothing compared to the lifetime Lily had lost. Others thought his life was already destroyed, that he'd never work with youth again, that he was carrying a burden that would never leave him. I didn't know what I thought. The anger I'd felt as a teenager had calcified into something more complex. He'd made a terrible mistake born out of arrogance and pattern recognition bias. He deserved consequences. But he also wasn't a monster, just a flawed human who'd been put in a position of responsibility he wasn't equipped to handle. The real monsters were the systems that failed, the camp that hadn't trained its counselors properly, the culture that prioritized convenience over vigilance. When Sophie was 12, she wanted to go to overnight camp. Every parenting bone in my body screamed no, but Jennifer pointed out that I couldn't let my trauma prevent our daughter from normal childhood experiences. We compromised. Sophie could go to camp, but only one I'd personally vetted and approved. I spent months researching options, finally settling on a program that had exemplary safety records and emergency protocols that went far beyond industry standards. The night before we drove Sophie to camp for drop-off, I couldn't sleep. Jennifer found me at 2 a.m. sitting in Sophie's room, watching her sleep. She's going to be fine, Jennifer whispered. I know their protocols. Their counselors are trained to respond to any emergency within 2 minutes. They have 24-hour medical staff on site. The lake has lifeguards during all swimming times and is off-limits after dark. I nodded, but the fear didn't go away. When we dropped Sophie off and I met her counselor, a woman in her 30s named Patricia Daniels, who had 8 years of experience and multiple safety certifications, I pulled her aside. If you hear screaming, investigate immediately. Don't assume it's a prank. Don't wait to verify, just check. Patricia looked confused by the intensity of my request, but she nodded. Of course, that's standard protocol here. Any potential emergency gets immediate response. I wanted to tell her about Camp Clearwater, about Lily Morrison, about the cost of assumptions and delays, but I didn't, because I didn't want to make Sophie's camp experience about my baggage. The 2 weeks Sophie was at camp were the longest of my life. I checked my phone obsessively, waiting for a call that something had gone wrong, but the call never came. Sophie came home happy and sunburned, full of stories about swimming and archery and making friendship bracelets. She'd had a wonderful time and wanted to go back next summer. I smiled and told her of course she could, and later that night I cried in relief that she'd gotten the camp experience I'd been denied. Lily Morrison would have been 33 years old the year Sophie went to camp. I thought about that often. What would Lily have been doing? Would she have been married, had kids, pursued a career? All the possibilities that had been stolen from her because someone hadn't taken 5 minutes to check. I continued my work in youth safety for 15 years. I reviewed hundreds of camps, schools, and programs. I trained thousands of counselors and staff members in emergency response protocols, and at every training session, I told them about Camp Clearwater. I didn't use Lily's name because her family deserved privacy, but I told them about the counselor who'd assumed screaming was a prank, about the girl who'd drowned while people listened and did nothing, about the tragedy that could have been prevented with one simple check. Your job isn't just to run activities and keep kids entertained, I'd tell them. Your job is to keep them alive, and that means investigating every potential emergency no matter how unlikely it seems. It means setting aside your pride and your assumptions and your convenience. It means accepting that you might be wrong and acting anyway. The counselors would listen with wide eyes, some of them barely older than the kids I'd been at Camp Clearwater. I hoped the story would stick with them, that when they heard something concerning, they'd remember and check. That they'd be the person Nathan Greer had failed to be. The 30th anniversary of Lily's death came when I was 44. The local newspaper did a retrospective piece, interviewing Lily's parents who'd never fully recovered from their loss, interviewing Nathan who'd moved across the country and worked in construction under a different name, interviewing some of the other campers who'd been there. They reached out to me too, but I declined. I didn't need to revisit it publicly because I revisited it privately every day. Instead, I wrote a letter to Lily's parents. I'd never contacted them before, never knew what to say that wouldn't sound hollow or self-serving. But on the 30th anniversary, I felt compelled to tell them something. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Morrison, I was in cabin 7 at Camp Clearwater the night Lily died. I heard her screaming and did nothing because my counselor told me it was a prank. I've spent my entire adult life trying to make sure what happened to Lily never happens to another child. I work in camp safety, training counselors and reviewing protocols. I tell your daughter's story, though not her name, to every new counselor I train. I want you to know that Lily's death wasn't meaningless. It's created ripples that have saved lives. Every time a counselor investigates because they remember the consequences of not investigating, that's Lily's legacy. I'm sorry I couldn't save her, but I've tried to honor her memory by making sure others don't face the same fate. I hope that brings you some small measure of peace. I sent the letter not expecting a response. But 3 weeks later, I received one. Mrs. Morrison wrote back in careful handwriting. Thank you for your letter. Thank you for the work you do. Thank you for remembering Lily as a person, not just a tragedy. We miss her every day. Knowing that her death has prevented others brings us the only comfort we can find. Please continue your work. It matters more than you know. Sophie graduated high school and decided to major in emergency management at college. She told me she'd been inspired by the work I did, by the passion I brought to making systems safer. I was proud and terrified at school and decided to measure, because it meant she understood the stakes, understood that systems fail and people die when we're not vigilant. On her first day of college, I drove her to campus and helped her move into her dorm. As I was leaving, she hugged me tight and said, Dad, I know why you do what you do. I know about Camp Clearwater. I Googled it years ago after I overheard you and Mom talking. I'm going to help too. We're going to make things better. I cried on the drive home, overwhelmed by the strange way tragedy propagates through generations, how one terrible night when I was 14 had shaped my entire life and was now shaping my daughter's. But maybe that was how things got better. Not through forgetting, but through remembering and acting, through letting the pain fuel purpose instead of just sitting with it as an open wound. I'm 50 now and still working in youth safety. My hair is gray and my back hurts and I'm supposedly getting close to retirement age, but I can't imagine stopping. Every protocol I improve, every counselor I train, every emergency response system I help implement is another small wall between children and preventable tragedies. Last month, I was reviewing a new summer camp in Colorado, walking through their facilities with the director. We got to the lake, beautiful and clear, surrounded by pine trees. The director was explaining their swimming protocols when we heard shouting from the water. A counselor immediately blew a whistle, and lifeguards moved into position. Within 30 seconds, staff had verified it was just kids playing, but they'd responded anyway. They'd checked. Good response time, I said to the director. She smiled. We take safety seriously here. One of our staff trainers told us a story once about a camp where they didn't check screaming and a girl drowned. That story stuck with me. We always check, no matter what. I felt my throat tighten. Lily's story, the one I'd told hundreds of times, had made it here. Had influenced this director's protocols, had maybe, in this small way, saved someone. That's good, I managed to say. That's the right approach. As I drove home that evening, I thought about Nathan Greer, wherever he was now, living with what he'd done. I thought about the other counselors who'd heard the screaming and done nothing. I thought about all of us in Cabin 7 who'd stayed in our bunks. But mostly I thought about Lily Morrison, 17 years old, drowning in dark water while people listened and assumed she wasn't worth checking on. She deserved better. Every child deserves better. And maybe, just maybe, after 36 years of work and training and protocol changes, we're finally getting closer to a world where better is the standard instead of the exception. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.